Jamal sat nervously in the crowded terminal, his eyes scanning the boarding gate as the overhead announcement blared through the intercom. He was a 15-year-old boy from a modest background, traveling alone for the first time to visit his father in a city across the country. His father, who he hadn't seen in months, was waiting for him on the other side of the long flight. The excitement and anticipation of reuniting with his dad filled him with a mix of joy and nervous energy. But his flight wasn't going as planned, and it was about to take a turn that would change everything. The plane had just finished boarding, and Jamal found his seat on the bustling flight, his eyes glancing around nervously at the strangers seated nearby. A few moments later, a flight attendant walked down the aisle, checking each seat before takeoff. Her name tag read Sarah, and at first, she smiled politely at Jamal as she passed. He tried his best to seem calm, but inside, he felt the familiar unease of being the only black kid on a flight full of strangers. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Jamal settled back into his seat, feeling the vibrations of the engine beneath him. He couldn't help but smile. His father was waiting for him, and in just a few hours, he'd be there, away from the noise and chaos of his neighborhood. It was supposed to be a simple trip, an adventure even, but that all changed when the incident occurred. About 20 minutes into the flight, Jamal, who had been looking out the window, noticed a commotion in the aisle. It started with a quiet voice, then escalated. Sarah, the flight attendant, was standing just a few rows ahead, talking to a passenger. Her words were low at first, but Jamal could sense that something was wrong. His heart began to race. He wasn't paying attention to the conversation, but a sharp, accusatory tone made him uneasy. When the conversation turned to him, Jamal's stomach dropped. "You." Sarah's voice cracked through the air, cutting through the hum of the plane's engines. "You're the one causing the problem." Jamal froze. He had no idea what she was talking about. He hadn't caused any trouble. He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't even moved from his seat except to adjust his backpack. Confused, he looked up at her. "Excuse me, I don't know what you mean," Jamal replied, his voice steady but uncertain. Sarah stepped toward him, her face a mask of stern authority. "I've had enough of your behavior," she said, her voice raising. "You need to get off the plane." Jamal's mouth went dry. The entire row of passengers, some of whom had been trying to catch a nap, suddenly stared at him. The flight attendant's words echoed in his head, but none of it made sense. He couldn't understand why she was accusing him. He hadn't done anything wrong. "I didn't do anything," he said, his voice shaking. A few passengers began whispering, and the noise escalated. "What's going on?" One woman muttered, looking over the seat in front of her. "This isn't right." Jamal glanced around the cabin, his face growing hot with embarrassment. He felt like the center of attention in a moment that should have been peaceful. "I said, get off the plane." Sarah snapped, her voice now full of venom. Jamal's eyes widened, and his heart began to race faster. He was still sitting in his seat, stunned by her words. There was no warning, no explanation. "I haven't done anything," he repeated, but Sarah wasn't listening. One of the other flight attendants stepped forward, a man named Greg, who seemed more concerned with the disruption than anything else. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Sarah and Jamal, who was still sitting in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests. "Yes," Sarah replied coldly. "This boy is causing a disturbance and needs to be removed." Greg, who had been a quiet observer until now, gave Jamal a sympathetic look before turning back to Sarah. "Come on, Sarah. Maybe we can." But before he could finish, Sarah's voice interrupted him. "No, this has gone far enough. We need to follow procedure." Jamal was stunned. He didn't know what to do, who to trust. The other passengers were silent now, their gazes fixed on the unfolding scene. Sarah didn't give him a chance to explain. She was already walking toward the front of the plane, beckoning for him to follow her. Jamal stood up, trembling, still unable to grasp what was happening. His mind raced, and every step he took toward the front felt heavier. "Please, You don't understand. I'm just trying to get to my dad, Jamal pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah didn't respond. She reached the door of the plane, and Jamal had no choice but to follow her out into the terminal. His heart pounded as he walked down the narrow aisle, past rows of bewildered passengers who stared in disbelief. His face burned with the sting of humiliation. He had been kicked off a plane, for no reason at all. The cold air hit him as the door opened, and the ground crew stared at him with confusion. Jamal was now outside the plane, standing in the terminal with no explanation, no ticket, and no idea of what to do next. He looked back at the plane. The aircraft that had just moments ago felt like a doorway to freedom, and now it felt like an unscalable wall. The flight attendant, Sarah, stood in the doorway, watching him leave, her face unreadable. As the door shut behind him, Jamal felt the weight of the moment settle over him. His life had just changed in a way he couldn't yet understand. Jamal stood frozen on the cold, sterile floor of the airport terminal, the distant hum of planes and muffled conversations swirling around him. The harsh fluorescent lights above seemed to add to the discomfort of the moment. His legs felt like lead, heavy with the weight of confusion and embarrassment. He stared at the plane through the glass windows, its engines roaring as it slowly taxied down the runway. He had been kicked off. He had no idea why or how, and the fact that no one seemed to understand what had just happened made it feel even worse. His mind raced as he tried to piece everything together, but it didn't make sense. He hadn't done anything wrong. His heart thudded in his chest, but the confusion began to give way to frustration. He needed answers, needed someone to hear him out. He turned toward the nearest gate agent, a middle-aged woman who was answering questions from another passenger. She looked up as Jamal approached, her expression shifting from polite professionalism to concern when she saw the look on his face. "Excuse me," Jamal began, his voice shaking despite his efforts to steady it. "I was just removed from my flight. I don't know what happened. The flight attendant just accused me of causing a disturbance and kicked me off the plane." The woman raised an eyebrow, a slight frown forming as she glanced at the boarding pass in his hand. "I'm sorry, but I don't have any information on that. Let me check with my supervisor." Jamal's frustration mounted as he watched her walk away, leaving him standing alone, with nothing but a twinge of anger building inside him. He had no idea where to go next. His ticket was worthless now, and he had no way of getting back on the plane. His father was waiting for him, expecting him to show up soon. Jamal had been dreaming of this trip for months, the first time he was flying alone to visit his father. He had imagined the moment they'd reunite at the airport, the excitement in his father's eyes, the hugs, the stories they would share. Now, it felt like that dream was slipping through his fingers. Jamal sat down in one of the terminal's plastic chairs, his backpack still clutched tightly in his hands. He glanced around, but no one paid him any attention. They were all too caught up in their own little worlds. A group of teenagers walked past him, laughing loudly, oblivious to the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. He felt so out of place, so isolated. No one knew what he was going through. No one cared. It felt like hours before the gate agent returned. "I've spoken with my supervisor," she said, her voice apologetic but distant. "They're saying that there's nothing they can do right now. You'll have to speak with customer service for a refund, or to get rebooked." A refund? Rebooked? Jamal's mind spun in disbelief. He couldn't understand why this was happening to him. He had done everything right. He had arrived on time, had boarded the plane without issue. He hadn't done anything to provoke the flight attendant, nothing that could justify being thrown off like that. "I don't want a refund," Jamal said, his voice louder now, filled with the frustration that had been bubbling up inside him. "I need to get back on that plane. I need to go to my dad." The gate agent raised her hand slightly, her expression apologetic but unyielding. "I understand, but I'm afraid you'll have to take it up with customer service. They'll have more information." Jamal's face flushed with heat. He wanted to argue, to make her see how serious this was, but he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was alone in a crowded airport, stranded without answers. The tears that had been threatening to come for the past hour finally stung at the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He wasn't going to break down in front of everyone. Not now. He turned away from the counter, his legs feeling weaker with each step. He walked past the bustling crowds, trying to ignore the stares of the few people who looked his way. He found a bench in the corner of the terminal and sat down, staring blankly at the floor. Time seemed to crawl. Jamal checked his watch. The flight had left over an hour ago. He was stranded. He had no idea when the next available flight would be, or if they'd even let him back on. He didn't have the money to buy another ticket, not on his own. The thought of trying to explain everything again, to fight for his right to be on that plane, seemed hopeless. Suddenly, he heard a voice. It was a man's voice, a calm and friendly tone that contrasted sharply with the tension in Jamal's chest. "Hey, you okay?" Jamal looked up and saw a man approaching him, around his father's age, dressed in a business suit. He carried a briefcase and looked like someone who had been traveling for a while. Jamal hesitated for a moment before nodding. The man sat down beside him, giving him a sympathetic look. "You don't look all right," the man said softly. "What happened?" Jamal didn't feel like explaining at first, but something about the man's demeanor made him feel like it might be okay. He took a deep breath and told the man everything. The flight attendant, the accusations, being kicked off the plane. The man listened intently, his expression changing from curiosity to concern. "That's ridiculous," the man muttered under his breath. "I don't know what happened, but that doesn't sound right at all." "I didn't do anything," Jamal replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to see my dad. I don't know why she kicked me off the plane." The man's eyes softened. "It's not your fault," he said firmly. "Sometimes people just act out of line. It happens more often than you think. You know what? I might be able to help." Jamal looked at him in surprise. "How?" The man smiled slightly. "I've been traveling for work for years. I've got some connections here. If you're stuck, I might be able to help you get back on another flight." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But we need to figure out who the real problem is here. And I think I have an idea." Jamal blinked, uncertain. "What do you mean?" The man leaned closer, his voice lowering. "It sounds like that flight attendant had something against you. Maybe it wasn't just about the flight. Maybe there's more to it. But I've got a feeling we'll figure it out. And if I'm right, she won't get away with this." Jamal stared at the man, unsure whether to believe him, but for the first time since he was kicked off the plane, he felt a small flicker of hope. Jamal sat in stunned silence for a few moments, processing the man's words. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but the fact that someone had come to his aid, offering to help him navigate the mess, gave him a small sense of relief. He had been feeling so isolated, like nobody understood what had just happened to him or cared. Now, this stranger was showing genuine concern, and he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced all afternoon. Hope. The man, who introduced himself as Mr. Thompson, was a middle-aged businessman with graying hair and a calm demeanor. He looked like someone who had seen his fair share of travel-related hassles, but there was a depth in his eyes that suggested he had experienced things that were far more complicated than missed flights or lost baggage. Jamal, still unsure whether to trust him fully, found himself listening intently. "I've seen this kind of thing before," Mr. Thompson said, speaking with a reassuring authority. "It's rare, but sometimes people like that flight attendant let personal biases get in the way of their professional duties. And honestly, it doesn't matter what you were doing or not doing. No one should have treated you like that." Jamal's stomach churned at the thought. He had been wrongly accused, humiliated, and tossed off the plane like a criminal, but hearing Mr. Thompson's words felt like a small salve to the sting. His mind wandered back to the faces of the passengers, the cold, indifferent looks of some, and the few who'd seemed to notice what was happening. No one had spoken up, no one had defended him. Everyone had just quietly watched as Sarah, the flight attendant, had made her decision. It felt like being abandoned by everyone in that moment. Why would she single me out? Jamal muttered, more to himself than to Mr. Thompson. I didn't do anything. Mr. Thompson nodded, the lines around his eyes tightening. Sometimes people have reasons for their actions that don't make sense to anyone else. They let their own insecurities or prejudices cloud their judgment. You're not the first person she's done this to, I'm guessing. Jamal's eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and rising anger flooding his chest. What do you mean? This isn't the first time she's done this to someone. Mr. Thompson sighed, looking around as if making sure no one was listening too closely. Not necessarily to you. But I can tell you this. People like Sarah don't just wake up one day and decide to be mean or discriminatory for no reason. She probably has a history of behaving like this, whether it's her bias against certain passengers or just an overpowering need to assert control. It's something I've seen too many times in my career. Jamal felt a rush of emotions. Anger, frustration, and something else he couldn't quite name. He had been too stunned to react in the moment, but now he found himself boiling with questions. But why me? Why did she pick me? Mr. Thompson paused for a long moment, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Sometimes it's because people like her see someone who's different from the norm as a target. It's subtle, but it's there. The way you were treated wasn't about anything you did. It was about her ability to assert power over someone she thought she could control. You happened to be that person. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to swallow down the rising frustration. The unfairness of it all was almost too much to bear. He had done nothing wrong, yet everything had unraveled in a way he couldn't have predicted. But he couldn't let the anger consume him, not now. What do we do now? He asked quietly, feeling the shift in his perspective. He couldn't just let it go. Not when everything felt so wrong. Now we do something about it, Mr. Thompson said with a quiet intensity, his eyes gleaming with determination. You need to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. If we dig into this, we might uncover a pattern. And if that's the case, Sarah might have to face consequences. You shouldn't have been treated like that. And I'll help you make sure the airline knows exactly what happened. Jamal nodded, his mind still swirling, but a clear resolve settling in. It wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about standing up for himself, for his dignity. He had to make sure that nobody else had to experience what he had. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just an isolated incident. If Mr. Thompson's hunch was right, this could be part of a bigger issue. And if he didn't take action now, he might never have another chance. Mr. Thompson made a few quick calls, giving Jamal detailed instructions about who to speak to, where to go in the terminal, and how to file a formal complaint. The process felt tedious, but Jamal followed every step. At the very least, it gave him something to do other than sit and wait. He wasn't alone in this anymore. The sense of helplessness he had felt earlier was starting to fade, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. As Jamal followed Mr. Thompson's instructions and made his way toward the customer service desk, he couldn't help but notice how people began to look at him differently. The few who had witnessed the incident now seemed to acknowledge him, nodding with sympathetic expressions. A man in a suit gave him a small, reassuring smile as he passed by, and Jamal began to sense that maybe, just maybe, there were people out there who understood. Jamal's mind raced as he made his way back through the terminal, clutching his phone in his hand. He'd filed a complaint, made the calls, and now, all he could do was wait. The sense of urgency in Mr. Thompson's voice had spurred him into action, but now that the dust had settled a little, Jamal was left with the uncomfortable feeling of being caught in a game he didn't fully understand. He had expected the confrontation with the flight attendant to be the climax of this ordeal, but instead, it felt like just the beginning. After hours of pacing, talking to airline employees, and following Mr. Thompson's advice, Jamal finally found himself boarding another plane, this time to the same destination he had originally set out for. The delay had been long enough for him to digest the situation, but as he walked down the jet bridge, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And then, as if the universe was playing some cruel joke on him, Jamal stepped into the aircraft and froze. There, standing just a few rows away, was Sarah, the flight attendant who had kicked him off the last plane. She was standing by the aisle, assisting another passenger with their overhead luggage. When she saw Jamal, her eyes narrowed in recognition. His heart sank. It felt like the last thing he wanted, being face to face with the person who had humiliated him just hours before. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jamal couldn't back down now. Not when he had come this far. Not when there was still so much to uncover. As the flight continued to board, Jamal found his seat, doing his best to keep his emotions in check. He wasn't sure how to handle this situation, but he couldn't let Sarah's presence derail his resolve. He had a mission now, one that was bigger than just his own hurt. It was about accountability, justice, and making sure no one else had to go through what he had. The plane was nearly full, and as Sarah passed by his seat, she gave him a cursory glance, avoiding direct eye contact. Jamal couldn't let it go, not when everything felt so wrong. He had to say something, confront her directly. He stood up abruptly, the words on the tip of his tongue. Sarah froze, clearly startled by his sudden movement. "Why did you do it?" Jamal's voice was steady, but his chest tightened with a mix of anger and disbelief. He was done being passive. It was time to get answers. Sarah's face shifted into an expression of practiced indifference. "Excuse me," she replied coolly, as if she hadn't just thrown him off a plane hours ago. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Jamal said, his voice growing stronger. "Why did you kick me off the plane? I didn't do anything wrong." The surrounding passengers began to take notice, some glancing over, their attention now fully on the exchange. Jamal's heart pounded, but this time, it was different. There was a strange sense of clarity in his anger. He wasn't the same boy he had been when he first stepped onto that plane, the one too embarrassed and confused to speak up. Now, he was the one with the power to demand answers. Sarah's face hardened, her eyes briefly flicking toward the other passengers. She straightened, trying to regain her composure, but there was a subtle shift in her stance. "I was following procedure," she said, her voice tight. "There was a disturbance. I had to act quickly." Jamal wasn't buying it. "A disturbance? I didn't do anything. I was sitting in my seat, minding my own business. You just singled me out." She took a step back, a defensive posture creeping into her body language. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice now slightly trembling. "I did what I had to do. Now, please sit down. This is not the place for this." Jamal's anger flared, but something told him that pushing further might only escalate things. Instead, he took a deep breath and returned to his seat, though not without casting a final pointed glance at Sarah. He could feel her eyes on him, her gaze sharp and calculating. As the plane finally took off, Jamal leaned back in his seat, his thoughts still racing. He had expected some kind of confrontation, but he hadn't anticipated the coldness, the utter lack of remorse in Sarah's response. The fact that she wasn't even willing to admit her mistake only fueled his desire to keep fighting. That evening, after the flight landed and he made his way out of the airport, Jamal's phone buzzed. It was a message from Mr. Thompson. "Jamal, I know you're probably feeling a lot right now, but you're doing the right thing. Sarah has a history. Trust me. I've been talking to some folks, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. Don't back down. Stay strong." Jamal stared at the message for a moment, his hand gripping the phone tightly. He didn't know what Mr. Thompson meant by history, but a part of him already suspected that this wasn't the first time Sarah had acted out of line. He had seen it in her eyes, the coldness, the dismissiveness toward him. It wasn't just a mistake, it felt deliberate. The next morning, Jamal received a phone call from the airline. He braced himself for another round of customer service bureaucracy, but this time, The voice on the other end was different. It was a supervisor, and the tone of the conversation immediately shifted from the usual scripted apologies to something more serious. "We've reviewed your complaint and are looking into the incident," the supervisor said, his voice calm but firm. "We take these matters very seriously, and after speaking with several passengers who were on the flight, it appears that the situation wasn't handled properly. We want to ensure this doesn't happen again." Jamal's stomach twisted. He had hoped for an apology, for some form of validation, but hearing that his complaint was being taken seriously made it real. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no turning back. This wasn't just about his flight anymore. This was about holding people accountable and making sure that Sarah's actions didn't go unnoticed. The supervisor on the phone explained that they would conduct an investigation, and while Jamal couldn't fully predict the outcome, he knew one thing for sure: he had sparked something bigger than himself. He had made the airline listen, and now he had to stay strong through whatever came next. As Jamal hung up the phone, he realized something important. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for anyone who had ever been mistreated, anyone who had been ignored or belittled. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The days following the phone call from the airline supervisor felt like a blur of emotions. Jamal didn't know what to expect, but each day was filled with a mix of uncertainty, anticipation, and an underlying sense of dread. His complaint was being investigated, and the weight of that fact rested heavily on his shoulders. He had done the right thing, he told himself, but now came the real test. What would come of it? How far would he be willing to push this? What if he lost everything? The respect, the apology, the chance to move on. Jamal tried to focus on the purpose of his trip, seeing his father, the man who had been waiting for him at the airport, eagerly anticipating his arrival. He was grateful for his father's support, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, the flight attendant, the one who had ruined his flight. He didn't want to dwell on it, but he couldn't help it. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the coldness in her eyes as she tossed him off the plane with no explanation, like a disposable inconvenience. But that wasn't who he was. He wasn't just going to let it go. Not now. Not when he had a chance to make a difference. The days dragged on, and Jamal found himself spending more time with his father, reconnecting after months of being apart. His father's house was warm, filled with memories of better times, and Jamal soaked up the comfort, even as the anger from his ordeal gnawed at him in the background. The only time he felt truly at ease was when his father asked about the details of his trip, and Jamal could briefly forget the incident. But then, just as the days started to slip into a familiar rhythm, Jamal received another call from the airline. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't just a supervisor. It was a higher-up, someone with authority. His heart raced as the voice introduced herself as a senior executive, the person responsible for handling sensitive complaints. "We've reviewed everything carefully, Jamal," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We interviewed several passengers who were on the flight with you, including one of the crew members. And after a thorough investigation, we have concluded that the flight attendant's actions were inappropriate and unjustified." Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly followed by a rush of something else: vindication. Finally, someone was acknowledging what had happened to him. He had been right all along. He hadn't deserved to be treated like that. "We are taking disciplinary action regarding the flight attendant's behavior," the senior executive continued. "We understand that this situation was distressing for you, and we sincerely apologize for the treatment you received. In addition, we are offering you compensation for the inconvenience, and we'd like to extend a formal invitation for you to come to the airline's headquarters to discuss the matter further if you'd like." Jamal's mind raced as he processed the words. He wasn't sure how to feel about the compensation. It felt like a hollow gesture, something that would never make up for the humiliation he had endured. But the fact that Sarah was being held accountable, it felt like a victory. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice and been too afraid to speak up. "I appreciate the apology," Jamal replied, his voice steady but emotional. "But I don't want compensation. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The senior executive paused, and Jamal could hear the surprise in her voice. "We understand, Jamal. Your feedback is valuable, and we'll be reviewing our policies to ensure that something like this never happens again." The conversation ended soon after, but the feeling of closure was still a long way off. Jamal had won this battle, but he knew the war wasn't over. Holding Sarah accountable was only one piece of the puzzle. This was about change, about making sure that the system wasn't designed to overlook people like him, people who were often invisible until they were in a situation like his. He wanted to make sure that the airline took a hard look at its policies, that every flight attendant was trained to understand their power and how they wield it. If Sarah had acted in this way, then who else had suffered the same fate? Jamal felt both exhausted and exhilarated as he hung up the phone. He had done something most people wouldn't have had the courage to do. He had fought back, not with violence or anger, but with his voice. And that voice had been heard. The next day, Jamal and his father sat down to talk. His father, though understanding of the emotional toll the situation had taken on Jamal, was proud of him. "You did the right thing," his father said, his voice filled with pride. "You didn't let that woman's actions define who you are. You stood up for yourself and others. And that's something to be proud of." Jamal looked at his father, a slight smile tugging at his lips. It felt good to hear those words. It felt like validation, like the weight of everything was finally lifting off his shoulders. He realized, in that moment, that it wasn't just about the incident with the flight attendant. It was about reclaiming his dignity and finding strength in the face of adversity. It was about refusing to let someone else's hate or prejudice shape his future. He knew this wouldn't be the last challenge he faced, but it was a reminder that he was capable of standing his ground. The next few weeks passed, and the story of what had happened to Jamal began to spread. News outlets picked it up, and soon the airline found itself under public scrutiny. Passengers who had been on the flight reached out, expressing their support for Jamal's bravery. People who had never met him, who had no idea who he was, were rallying behind him. He had become a symbol of standing up to injustice, of using your voice when it felt like no one was listening. Sarah, the flight attendant, was eventually removed from her position, and while that didn't bring Jamal the closure he had hoped for, it was a reminder that accountability matters. The airline made several changes to its training programs, implementing new policies on discrimination and mistreatment. Jamal's actions had made an impact, and he had helped create a ripple effect that would hopefully prevent this from happening to anyone else. As Jamal stood by the window of his father's house, looking out at the city beyond, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in weeks. He had come through the storm, stronger than before. But most importantly, he had learned something invaluable. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought with fists, but with conviction. And that conviction had changed everything. In the weeks that followed, Jamal's life began to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. The fight that had started with a single, painful incident on a plane had become a turning point not only in his life, but in the lives of many others. Word of his actions spread far beyond the airline's headquarters. His story was picked up by news outlets, local and national, and Jamal found himself at the center of a media storm. People were praising him for his bravery, for standing up against an injustice that could have been so easily ignored. But even as his phone rang constantly with interviews, messages, and offers of support, Jamal felt a strange mix of pride and unease. It wasn't the attention that had drawn him into this fight. It was the principle. It had always been about standing up for what was right. But now, as he looked back on everything that had transpired, he realized how deeply it had impacted him, how much he had changed. The boy who had boarded that plane, unsure of his place in the world, had been transformed into a young man who understood his own power. He had learned to use his voice, not just for himself, but for others who couldn't speak up. He understood now that one person could make a difference, That one action could spark a movement. And while he didn't seek recognition for what he'd done, it was impossible to ignore the impact it had had. As Jamal sat in his father's living room one evening, the two of them watched the evening news. The anchor was covering the aftermath of the incident, interviewing passengers who had witnessed what had happened. Some of them had spoken out in support of Jamal. Others had shared their disbelief at how poorly the situation had been handled. It was all being framed as a story of injustice, a story of a young boy who had been wronged but refused to stay silent. Jamal watched the broadcast with mixed feelings. He had never sought to become a symbol. He had never wanted to be the face of something bigger. But here he was, whether he liked it or not. His father, sensing the emotional toll this had taken on Jamal, spoke up. "You've done something incredible, son. Don't forget that." Jamal nodded slowly, but the weight of the moment was heavy on his shoulders. "I didn't think it would turn into all this. I just wanted to be treated like everyone else. I wanted to make sure no one else had to go through what I did." His father smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's exactly what you've done. Sometimes the hardest part isn't doing the right thing. It's dealing with everything that comes after. But you've handled it with more strength than most people could ever imagine." Jamal couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. But even as his father's words comforted him, another thought lingered in the back of his mind. The story wasn't over yet. The airline had apologized, had taken action, but that wasn't enough. Jamal knew that real change wouldn't happen with one person's resignation or a few new policies. Real change would take time, and it would take more than just his own voice. It would take the collected voices of people who had experienced similar injustices, people who hadn't had the courage to speak up. Jamal was starting to see a bigger picture, one where his fight was just the beginning of something much more profound. A few weeks after the investigation was concluded, Jamal was invited to speak at a community event focused on racial equality and social justice. It was a huge honor, but it was also a daunting one. He had never spoken in front of a crowd before, let alone a group of people who would be looking to him for guidance. He was nervous, unsure if he had the right words to say. But when he stood on that stage, facing a room full of people who had been affected by similar struggles, something inside him shifted. He felt the weight of his responsibility, yes, but he also felt something else, empowerment. He spoke about his experience on the plane, not just as a victim, but as someone who had chosen to take action. He talked about the importance of speaking up when something isn't right, even if it's uncomfortable or difficult. He spoke about how the system often overlooked people like him, and how one voice could create a ripple effect that could eventually lead to change. His words weren't perfect, but they were real. And as he looked out into the crowd, he saw nods of agreement, faces filled with empathy and understanding. It was a humbling experience. Jamal knew that the journey he had begun was far from over. The issues he had faced on the plane were just a small part of a larger systemic problem that needed to be addressed. After his speech, people came up to him, some with tears in their eyes, others with gratitude for his courage. Many shared their own stories of discrimination, mistreatment, and injustice. Jamal listened, truly listened, to each one. It was overwhelming, but it also deepened his resolve. The fight for equality and respect was not an individual battle. It was a collective effort, one that required people to stand together and speak out, no matter how difficult it might be. It was in that moment, surrounded by people who had walked similar paths, that Jamal truly understood the power of what he had started. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unworthy. He was part of something much bigger than himself, and that realization gave him the strength to keep going. The airline's apology and the disciplinary action against Sarah had been a victory. But Jamal knew that the real victory would come when society as a whole recognized the value of fairness, dignity, and respect for all people, regardless of their race, background, or status. As the months passed, Jamal continued to speak out, to fight for justice in his community. His story, though initially about a single unjust incident, had become a beacon for others. He had started a conversation that couldn't be ignored, and as more and more people joined the cause, it became clear that Jamal's small act of defiance had sparked a much larger movement. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, times when it felt like nothing was changing. But Jamal knew that progress took time, and that the more people who spoke out, the stronger the movement would become. One evening, as Jamal sat at the dinner table with his father, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had fought hard for what was right, and although the journey had been long and difficult, he had come out of it stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. As he looked around at the world that was slowly changing, he realized that the fight wasn't just about confronting injustice in a single moment. It was about building a future where people like him, and everyone else, would never have to fight for respect again. And with that thought in his heart, Jamal knew that, no matter where life took him, he would continue to stand up, speak out, and make sure his voice was always heard.